Can you believe that for 2 million years humanity lived free? 2 million years of roaming the wilderness, perfect adaptation, no bosses, no property, just the pure raw survival of the fittest under the endless, untamed sky. That was the contract. 1 million years of evolutionary perfection that we honored, until one single, disastrous moment changed everything forever. We're talking about the ultimate betrayal of the wild, a silent, slow-motion catastrophe that no one saw coming, the day we decided to stop being the planet's greatest predator and start being prisoners of the soil. This is not history as you know it. This is the origin story of every stress, every pandemic, every hierarchy, and every border fence that still plagues us today. Forget pyramids and empires. Forget Rome and Greece. Those civilizations are just the footnotes to the truly terrifying, magnificent, and epic-defining moment we call the Neolithic Revolution. This is where the world and our very nature died and was reborn in agonizing, protracted labor. What could possibly drive a species that had mastered the art of mobility, a species that had walked from Africa to the furthest reaches of the habitable globe, to suddenly stop, to chain themselves to a single patch of dirt, and to spend the rest of their short, miserable lives defending it? It wasn't a choice whispered by a sage. It was a scream forced by environmental apocalypse. Imagine the scene. The last gasp of the Ice Age, a terrifying era known as the Younger Dryas. Glaciers were retreating, then suddenly, impossibly, they surged back. The global climate system, the stable cradle that had allowed human hunters to thrive, stuttered and broke. Rainfall patterns vanished. Crucial megafauna began to disappear into the dust, and the very ground beneath the nomadic tribes became uncertain. The abundance was gone. The contract was null and void. The great herds that had sustained generations of skilled hunters simply evaporated, forcing populations into desperate, shrinking pockets of remaining fertility. This was the moment the clock ran out on the perfect, easy life. Humanity faced a binary choice: starve and vanish, or do the unthinkable. The unthinkable was farming. We had been harvesting wild grains for thousands of years, but never had we considered controlling them, owning them, forcing them into submission. It was an idea so radical, so against the grain of our very being, it must have been met with horror by the elders. They knew instinctively what we only confirm now through archaeology. The hunter-gatherer worked a 4-hour day and ate a varied, high-protein diet. The farmer would work 10 hours a day, suffer chronic back pain, and subsist on bland, carbohydrate-heavy gruel. Why would anyone sign up for this nightmare? Because the alternative was immediate extinction. The transformation began in a narrow, crescent-shaped strip of land, a geological miracle known as the Fertile Crescent, stretching from the Levant up into Mesopotamia. Here, and only here, the wild ancestors of wheat, barley, and legumes grew in such density that the desperate survivors realized they could hedge their bets. They could stop chasing the food and make the food chase them. This wasn't an act of genius. It was an act of profound, existential despair. The first farmers were not visionaries. They were refugees, cornered by a collapsing environment, forced to experiment with a high-risk, high-reward strategy that would permanently alter the human genome and the planet's surface. Look closely at the earliest Neolithic sites, those dust-choked villages of mud and reed. They are not monuments to achievement. They are prisons built of fear. The people who lived there were smaller, weaker, and suffered from more skeletal deformities, dental disease, and infectious pathogens than their Paleolithic ancestors. They traded health for security. They traded freedom for predictability. And the biggest change wasn't in the fields, it was in the mind. When you follow the food, you share what you find. When you grow the food, you must guard it fiercely. The very concept of surplus, of having more than you immediately need, was born in the Neolithic age. And with surplus came the fatal triad of civilization: property, hierarchy, and organized violence. Suddenly, those with the biggest fields or the deepest stores of grain became powerful. Those who defended the stores became warriors, and those without became subordinates. The egalitarian dream of the hunter-gatherer was shattered, replaced by a rigid social structure built upon the foundation of stored calories. We are watching, across this epical span of time, the invention of poverty. For the first time, people possessed things they could not eat, and ate things they did not want, merely to ensure they survived until the next catastrophic harvest. This was the ultimate high-wire act, a massive gamble placed on the unpredictable temper of the skies. And the stakes? The entire future of the species. Every single farmer, every single settlement, every single seed planted was an experiment under the shadow of extinction. We stand now on the precipice of this epic saga, ready to descend into the mud and the blood of the Fertile Crescent, to witness the quiet, terrifying moment when humanity put down the spear and picked up the hoe. We begin our descent into the dust of Göbekli Tepe, a site that defies everything we thought we knew about the origins of farming, a place where a complex, sophisticated structure appeared before the invention of agriculture, a place built, perhaps, to mourn the loss of the wild world, or perhaps to guide the desperate survivors into their new, terrifying existence. Prepare yourself. The revolution is about to begin. The revolution. It wasn't a celebratory parade. It was a funeral pyre set to the rhythm of impending famine. We are standing now, approximately 10,000 years before the modern calendar, right on the precipice of the abyss, watching our ancestors choose the shackles of the earth over the ancient intoxicating freedom of the chase. They didn't know it, but they were signing a contract written in dust and disease, binding humanity to a lifetime of endless, backbreaking, repetitive labor. They had exchanged the uncertainty of the next meal for the certainty of the next chore. This monumental, epic-defining error began not with philosophy, but with a single, dangerous plant. The magic trick, the single biological weapon that cemented this tragic transition, was grain. Specifically, emmer wheat and barley, the twin pillars of our subsequent misery and the foundation of all future empires. These were not the robust, easily harvested grasses of the wild that Paleolithic peoples occasionally gathered. These were genetically mutated dependents, screaming for constant human intervention to survive the winter. By selecting and breeding the strains that held their seeds tightly to the stalk, making them easier for us to collect, but impossible for them to naturally propagate, we became their slaves, just so they could live. They demanded water, they demanded weeding, and worst of all, they demanded to be guarded, because now those fragile seeds represented everything. For 2 million years, if you successfully hunted a megafauna, everyone shared the meat until it was gone, or dried it for communal consumption. If you found a patch of ripe berries, everyone ate. The concept of permanent, accumulated, non-perishable wealth was utterly alien, a dark ghost story told around a fading fire. But now, with the invention of the silo and the clay storage pot, the harvest belonged exclusively to the planter. The seeds in that pot meant power, security, and suddenly, the terrifying invention of the have and the have-not shattered the fiercely egalitarian spirit of the Paleolithic clan forever. This was the exact moment hierarchy was born, sealed in a mud brick granary filled with surplus grain. This surplus, the very definition of success in the Neolithic world, was the ultimate trap. It required complex organization, careful accounting, and ultimately a chief or priest class to manage its distribution, or more accurately, its retention. The shift was absolute, from a sharing economy based on immediate need to a transactional system based on debt, obligation, and ownership. The great betrayal wasn't just physical, it was psychological, fracturing the very core of human social bonding. They had become rich in stuff, but bankrupt in community. And then came the animals. We dragged the frantic, nervous energy of the wild goat and the placid utility of the wild sheep from the hills and forced them into pens right outside our new, permanent mud brick walls. It felt like winning, a guaranteed supply of meat, milk, and wool, a fantastic insurance policy against the fragility of the grain crops. But it was a Trojan horse of devastating biological warfare. The diseases that had previously stayed happily within the animal kingdom suddenly found a terrifying new host, the dense, sedentary, and immunologically naive human population living literally cheek by jowl with the herds. Smallpox, influenza, measles, these horrific plagues that would scour humanity for 10 millennia are not natural human afflictions. They are the Neolithic tax, the biological price we paid for proximity to our domesticated livestock. We built our settlements, and in doing so, we built the petri dish for future pandemics. They built houses, these new farmers, but they were not homes in the comfortable modern sense. They were heavy, permanent structures tethered inescapably to the fields they could no longer afford to abandon. They stopped walking. 2 million years of glorious, health-sustaining migration, following the sun and the herds, simply ceased. Their world shrank instantaneously to the view from their own porch, usually just a muddy square shared with their increasingly dense and smelly neighbors. This enforced stasis was the ultimate betrayal of the footloose, adaptive, nomadic spirit. The world became horrifyingly small, and the people became terrifyingly numerous. Because grain is soft food that can be processed into gruel, an easily digestible weaning food, and because settled life meant far less travel strain and caloric expenditure for the women, they could carry and feed more children more frequently. The birth rate skyrocketed almost overnight. The population didn't just grow, it exploded, multiplying human numbers tenfold in some regions in just a few thousand years. But this wasn't prosperity, it was crowding and intense resource strain. They traded resilience, the ability to move away from a disaster, for sheer volume. And volume, in the face of nature's unpredictable cruelty, is always a catastrophic gamble. One bad drought, one blight, one seasonal pestilence, and the entire community, which was now 10 times larger than any Paleolithic band, was facing mass starvation because they depended solely on 1 or 2 food sources. The fear became palpable, radiating outward like a shock wave. If you had a surplus, someone else desperately wanted it, or desperately needed to take it. The need to defend this fragile, concentrated, stored wealth led to the construction of the first great monuments of profound paranoia, the massive, intimidating walls and watchtowers of settlements like Jericho, built 9,000 years ago. Why the monumental effort? Because their desperate neighbors who had failed to plant or whose crops had failed were watching from the hills. The age of universal sharing was over. The age of organized defensive warfare had violently begun. This was the grim, bloody reality of the settled life. The hunter could always walk away from a ruined valley and find sustenance elsewhere. The farmer could not. He was bound not just by the heavy mortgage of his property, but by his own multiplied children, whom he had brought into the world in a desperate bid for more labor to work the fields. The Paleolithic exit strategy was gone, incinerated in the ashes of the first controlled burn. Humanity was finally and irrevocably trapped inside the self-constructed mud brick cage, staring out at the vibrant, healthy wilderness it had forever forsaken. The terrifying march toward empire, entrenched inequality, and industrial-scale suffering was now inevitable, and we haven't stopped marching since. The cage door is sealed. They had been promised security. They were delivered servitude. The hunter, who spent perhaps 4 hours a day actively hunting and gathering, who worked his mind and body in short and tense bursts followed by days of rest, was now extinct. In his place stood the farmer, chained to the clock of the sun, forced to toil from dawn till dusk, 7 days a week, just to protect a single, vulnerable crop. This was not the good life. This was relentless, soul-crushing drudgery, a biological slavery that would define humanity for 10,000 years. The very landscape became the enemy, demanding endless maintenance. The backbreaking rhythm of planting, weeding, and harvesting replaced the thrilling, varied landscape of the chase. You could not simply pack up and leave when the bugs came, or the drought hit, or the soil gave out its lifeblood. You were anchored, tethered to this single fixed point, watching your entire future wither and die in slow motion before your eyes. The farmers were forced into a pact with the land, a pact that demanded constant, excruciating labor that dramatically lowered their quality of life, a trade-off that should terrify anyone who romanticizes this era. But the terror of labor was only the first installment on the debt they now owed the earth. The second was biological annihilation, the immediate and explosive rise of plagues that had no business existing in the human population. For 2 million years, humans lived in small, mobile bands. When one person got sick, the band simply scattered, leaving the infectious pathogen nowhere to go and quickly extinguishing the outbreak. Now, suddenly, thousands were living shoulder to shoulder, defecating near their shared water sources, and most catastrophically, sharing air with newly domesticated animals like pigs, sheep, and cattle, a biological super collider. Skeletons recovered from early Neolithic graves tell a chilling story that the optimistic archaeologists dare not deny. They show systemic malnutrition, severe iron deficiency anemia from diets suddenly too reliant on one single grain, and the clear evidence of infectious disease scarring their bones. They were demonstrably sicker, smaller, and had shorter lifespans than their nomadic hunter-gatherer ancestors. They were living proof that settling down was not an upgrade, but a devastating biological downgrade. Progress? It sounds more like a mass casualty event that lasted generations. The hunter's diet was a rainbow of protein, fats, and micronutrients, a feast of variety guaranteed by constant mobility and opportunistic resource gathering. The farmer's diet? Starch, starch, and more starch. Wheat, barley, or rice, a feast of calories, yes, but a profound famine of everything else. The massive energy was there to fuel the work, but the essential building blocks for healthy bodies were missing. They sacrificed the quality of their food for the quantity and the certainty of storage, falling head first into the caloric trap. They had to eat 3 times as much plant matter just to equal the nutritional benefit of one successful hunt. And what happens when you rely on a single genetically similar source of food? One blight, one tiny insect, one hard winter, and the entire civilization starved simultaneously. This was famine on an industrial scale, a systemic vulnerability that was an impossibility for the diversified, opportunistic hunter. The early Neolithic sites are littered with the undeniable evidence of this devastating gamble. Their teeth, the ancient mirrors of health, show massive increases in cavities and painful dental abscesses, clear signs of constant carbohydrate exposure and poor oral hygiene inherent to packed settlements. Their very jaws were betraying them, rotting from the inside out, because they chose the easy, soft grain over the hard, nutritious kill. But wait, there is the third, darkest shadow cast by the fixed settlement, organized, entrenched warfare that redefined human violence. The Paleolithic skirmishes were often opportunistic raids, small-scale retribution, or necessary defense against territorial incursions. Brutal, yes, but rarely existential. But when a community spends an entire grueling year cultivating 100 acres of wheat, that wheat becomes the most valuable, irreplaceable thing in the universe. It is stored wealth, it is life insurance, and it must be defended at all costs. Settlements started building massive earthworks and, eventually, stone walls, not against the wolf or the bear, but against other people. The invention of the communal granary was simultaneously the invention of the fortress and the military draft. Now, war wasn't about prestige or individual honor. It was about resource control, about seizing the grain reserves that stood between your people and mass starvation the following winter. The stakes became astronomical. The farmer, trapped by his own disastrous ingenuity, had traded freedom for a precarious, often miserable stability. They had escaped the unpredictable terror of the wild, only to embrace the self-inflicted, predictable terror of civilization. The price of settling down was the rise of chronic disease, the certainty of mass famine, and the cold, hard logic of unending war. We left the natural world for the fortified farmstead, and the sacrifice was complete. The ultimate human betrayal was now fully realized. The ultimate human betrayal was fully realized, but the terrifying payment for that sin was only just beginning to be extracted. We had exchanged the vast, clean operating room of the Paleolithic landscape for the damp, crowded, and biologically toxic confines of the permanent settlement. For 2 million years, our bodies had been finely tuned instruments designed for movement and rapid dispersion. Suddenly, they were fixed targets, rooted to the spot by the demanding, unyielding gravity of the farmstead. This new life, this supposed comfort, demanded a biological toll far heavier than any ancient shaman could have imagined, an invisible assault that redefined human suffering. Imagine the horror of being constantly sick, a reality utterly foreign to the nomadic hunter-gatherer whose mobility was his primary defense against localized contamination. The Neolithic village was not a cradle of civilization. It was a pressurized, inescapable petri dish. When you move constantly, disease struggles to find a stable host population. The pathogen's epidemic potential is constantly defeated by human dispersal. But now, humanity was stacking itself in close, suffocating layers, clustered in mud-brick warrens where waste accumulated, and clean water was a mythological memory. This was the invention of density, and it was a death sentence for immune systems unprepared for such microscopic warfare. Our ancestors, in their rush for convenient protein, brought their wild cousins, the goats, the sheep, the pigs, the cattle, right into the immediate living space, a catastrophic biological merger. This profound, unnatural intimacy was the perfect staging ground for the most terrifying killers in human history, the zoonotic pathogens. The physical evidence screams this truth across the millennia. Analysis of Neolithic cemeteries shows the dramatic decline of human health immediately following the adoption of farming. The farmer was consistently shorter, weaker, and died years younger than the hunter he replaced, his lifespan brutally truncated by chronic illness and malnutrition. His teeth, once the pristine tools of a varied wild diet, were decaying husks riddled with cavities caused by the sugar-heavy, monotonous starch sludge of wheat and barley that now dominated every single meal. The skeletal remains show clear markers of iron deficiency anemia and constant infection, proving that while they ate more calories, they were critically less nourished. They were trapped in a cycle of exhausting labor just to acquire enough low-quality sustenance to survive the next illness. But disease was only half the cost of this Neolithic curse. The other half was the invention of something truly malignant, something that shattered the ancient code of equality: surplus. Hunter-gatherers lived in a magnificent, terrifying balance where their food spoiled fast, ensuring that no single person could hoard power. There was no lasting excess to fight over, no reason to subjugate a neighbor for the long term, guaranteeing a profound social egalitarianism. The moment humans mastered the ability to store grain in ceramic jars, pits, or sealed silos for 12 long months, everything changed forever. Suddenly, wealth was quantifiable, storable, defensible, and perhaps most importantly, leverageable. The person who managed the surplus became the person who controlled the community's future, and they quickly stopped working the fields themselves. These were the first bosses, the nascent elites, the temple priests who claimed divine rights over the bounty, and the warlords in training. They were the ruthless few who could weaponize the threat of famine against the very people who produced the food, leveraging the winter's cold logic for unending obedience. The free, egalitarian world of the Paleolithic vanished in a puff of grain dust, replaced by the crushing weight of institutionalized inequality. The heavy, controlling hand of patriarchy solidified here too. In the mobile world, women's foraging knowledge and labor were economically essential and highly valued, securing them high status. In the static, brutal world of the farmstead, where brute strength was needed for plowing, digging, and defending stored property, status became brutally tied to accumulated property and physical dominance, reducing the status of half of the population. The long, grueling hours demanded by the farm meant that children became economic necessities rather than communal joys. They were needed as immediate labor units in the field. The birth rate skyrocketed, not because life was easier or safer, but because labor was desperately needed to maintain the fragile agricultural system. More mouths meant more vulnerability, deepening the cycle of dependence into a terrifying, inescapable mire from which there was no return. And that stored dependence required absolute protection. If you have nothing, you can always run and restart. But if you have silos full of stored winter wheat, the accumulated effort of an entire year, running is not an option. You must stay and fight to the death. This necessity birthed the most sinister architectural invention of the age, the permanent fortification. They built walls not against the unpredictable dangers of the wilderness, but against the hungry shadows of their own kind, the neighbors who had failed to produce enough, or those who simply saw the easily quantifiable wealth as a target waiting to be seized. Archaeology reveals a horrifying spike in intentional, interpersonal trauma in Neolithic sites. Skulls crushed by blunt force instruments, arrowheads embedded in vertebrae, mass graves showing systematic execution. The evidence is undeniable. We had traded the relatively low-intensity, ritualistic skirmishes of the mobile past for the efficient, permanent, and total brutality of territorial warfare. The stakes were now absolute. Losing a hunt meant hunger. Losing the harvest meant the annihilation of your entire lineage. The Neolithic age was not a quiet dawn of peace. It was a high-stakes, bloody siege against entropy and against each other, a dark struggle where the smallest failure meant total collapse. Humanity had just locked itself inside the walls of its own making, watching the gates close on 2 million years of freedom, and the true horror of civilization was just beginning to stir beneath the mud. They had just locked themselves inside the walls of their own making, watching the gates close on 2 million years of freedom, and the true horror of civilization was just beginning to stir beneath the mud. This horror wasn't a sudden invasion or a climate shift. It was internal, microscopic, and utterly devastating to the human body that had spent millennia perfecting the art of survival in the wild. The price of permanent residence was a biological debt that humanity would spend the next 10,000 years attempting and failing to repay. The fields they so meticulously guarded were not just sources of grain, they were petri dishes, ideal breeding grounds for every microbial nightmare humanity had managed to outrun for millennia by the simple act of constantly moving. The Paleolithic immune system, honed by constant movement and small dispersed groups, was suddenly overwhelmed, facing an onslaught of pathogens designed to thrive in density. The settlers were living elbow to elbow with their future food supply, the sheep, the goats, the pigs. These creatures, now domesticated, brought with them a secret cargo, a biological time bomb waiting for the perfect vector jump. This was the moment of zoonotic transfer, the terrifying handshake between man and beast that unleashed plagues that would haunt us until the modern era. Measles, influenza, smallpox. These titans of historical mortality are not ancient curses. They are the direct, bloody inheritance of the Neolithic choice, the tragic byproduct of proximity. The hunter-gatherer world knew injury. It knew starvation, but it did not know the sheer, explosive density of contagious epidemic death that now stalked the alleys of the first permanent settlements, a silent predator invisible to the naked eye. The very air they breathed was tainted with the new reality of sedentary life. And the archaeological record does not lie, it screams. When scientists examine the skeletons unearthed from Neolithic sites, the evidence of this catastrophic biological shift is undeniable, painted across the very bones of the first farmers. They are, quite simply, smaller, frailer, riddled with stress markers that the sturdy skeletons of their nomadic ancestors rarely displayed. Enamel hypoplasias, lines etched into the teeth like tiny tombstones, marking repeated periods of near starvation or severe illness in childhood that permanently arrested growth. Arthritis began blooming prematurely in the joints, not from the vigorous pursuit of game, but from the back-breaking, monotonous labor of grinding grain, day after agonizing day, locked in a repetitive cycle of misery. But the New World had another, more insidious horror waiting in the wings, one that would redefine human interaction forever: the invention of surplus. Because farming generated a massive, storable excess of caloric energy that could last beyond the immediate season, it introduced the revolutionary and profoundly dangerous concept of value beyond immediate utility. The elder, the priest, the strong man. The names changed, but the function remained chillingly constant. They managed the risk of starvation, and in return for this management, they demanded absolute compliance and a share of the work. Hierarchy was not some inevitable cosmic fate. It was the direct, quantifiable consequence of storing large amounts of fermentable starch. The farmer was now utterly dependent. He was tethered to his patch of land, bound by the unforgiving seasonal cycle, and terrified of famine if the harvest failed. The hunter could simply walk away from a bad season and move on to better ground. The farmer, with his invested labor and his stored seed, could not. This dependency was the ultimate, non-violent tool for control, far more effective than any spear. You want to eat next winter? You must work harder this summer, and a substantial portion of that effort belongs to me, the protector of the stores, was the silent contract signed in sweat and soil. The agricultural treadmill became the primary, self-perpetuating mechanism of human exploitation. The work demanded was relentless: plowing, sowing, weeding, harvesting, grinding, a monumental increase in labor input compared to the Paleolithic average. If you refused, you were not just ostracized. You were signing your own death warrant, because the wild landscapes that once sustained your ancestors were now occupied, fenced off, or simply unable to support the population density created by the adjacent settlement. The gates were closed, and there was nowhere left to run. This system of controlled surplus naturally blossomed into the first rudimentary forms of the state, and, crucially, the invention of taxation. It wasn't monetary yet, it was just grain, or jars of oil, or lengths of woven cloth, a tribute extracted under the veiled but very real threat of exclusion from the food supply, or even outright force. The settlement now required organization far beyond the egalitarian tribal council. It demanded specialized roles: guards to protect the stores, record keepers, the precursors to writing itself, born out of needing to track debt and tribute, not poetry, and decision-makers who could mobilize labor for massive single-purpose projects like irrigation canals or formidable defensive walls. The great, terrifying paradox was complete. Humans worked exponentially harder and suffered greater biological stress to support a system that made them weaker, shorter, and perpetually indebted to the newly formed elite who simply held the key to the central storage shed. The betrayal was absolute. They had traded freedom for the illusion of security, and in doing so, they had unwittingly drafted the blueprint for every oppressive empire, every catastrophic inequality, and every major resource war that would follow. The walls of the Neolithic village, built to keep danger out, had truly become the permanent, gilded cage that locked humanity in, sealing their fate with every passing year. They had secured the walls, built their defenses against the screaming darkness outside, but the true infection began subtly, internally. The golden promise of abundance, the lush fields stretching to the horizon, quickly curdled into a never-ending, soul-crushing cycle of obligation. This was the profound betrayal of the Neolithic contract. Humanity traded freedom for sheer, brutal labor intensity. The Paleolithic ancestor might have worked a hard, dangerous 3 to 4 hours a day, punctuated by weeks of rest and travel, following the sacred rhythm of the seasons. The new Neolithic subject, however, was now a slave to the sun and the seed, tethered to the same patch of dirt for 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours a day during planting and harvest. This wasn't merely work. This was the invention of the grind, the inescapable 40-hour workweek perfected millennia before clock towers existed, the psychological toll mounting with every monotonous sunrise and set over the stagnant fields, binding them closer to their suffering. The very bones of the early farmers began to scream, showing clear signs of debilitating joint diseases, osteoarthritis, and spinal compression, pathologies utterly foreign to the active, wide-ranging lifestyle of their nomadic predecessors. The burden of intensive agriculture was quite literally crushing the human skeleton, molding their physiology into something brittle and fixed. The health catastrophe was not limited to the musculoskeletal breakdown of the body. The hunter's diet was varied, rich in complex nutrients, and spread across vast territories, naturally limiting the spread of persistent pathogens within the group. But now, humanity was tightly clustered, consuming a monotonous, starch-heavy diet that prioritized sheer calories and carbohydrate load over complex, vital nutrition. Malnutrition, ironically, became endemic even amid the supposed surplus. Dental health plummeted, with rampant tooth decay turning every meal into a minor agony, a silent epidemic fueled by sticky grains and starches, a horrifying trade-off for security. But the worst calamity was microbiological. The proximity to stored waste, the lack of effective sanitation for thousands of people living in dense proximity, and the constant intimate contact with domesticated animals, pigs, goats, cattle, now sharing the very structure of the human home, created the ultimate epidemiological petri dish. This tight grouping of species was the crucible where the great zoonotic nightmares were forged, jumping species barriers with terrifying efficiency, adapting rapidly to the vast, vulnerable human populations that provided perfect hosts. We are talking about the ancestor of measles, the progenitor of influenza, the slow, creeping terror of tuberculosis. Diseases that were trivial inconveniences or non-existent in the wide open spaces of the Paleolithic. These villages became vast, open-air biological weapons factories, creating the demographic crises that would periodically wipe out entire populations, forcing the survivors into even greater fear and dependence on the collective. The farmer lived longer on average than the hunter, perhaps, but their collective existence was punctuated by catastrophic outbreaks that dwarfed any single threat faced by their wandering ancestors. And where there is sedentary storage, there is instant, irresistible temptation and the creation of permanent inequality. The hunter-gatherer's wealth was portable, a good stone tool, a strong bow, knowledge. It was distributed by need and shared by instinct, dissolving naturally through movement. The farmer's wealth, however, was fixed, enormous, and highly visible. The towering silos of grain, the heavy pottery filled with preserved food, the fat of the herd. This fixed wealth demanded management, protection, and, most critically, control. It required a new kind of leader, not the respected elder or the bravest hunter, but the man who could successfully hoard the surplus, the one capable of mobilizing labor and defense. This was the birth of the big man, the permanent chief, the administrator who controlled access to the food that everyone now desperately needed to survive the inevitable lean season and the periodic plague. Suddenly, true, structural inequality was cemented into the foundation of society. Some ate better, lived longer, and commanded the labor of others, not through merit, but through control of the means of production. A concept terrifyingly modern, yet born in the muddy fields of the Fertile Crescent. The surplus, the supposed blessing, became the instrument of eternal servitude for the vast majority, creating new debt cycles that ensured compliance. They built massive communal structures, not just walls, but enormous granaries and specialized housing, showcasing this new rigid social strata, forcing everyone into specific, inescapable roles based on birth, social standing, and debt owed to the chief's central storehouse. Specialization meant efficiency, yes, but it also meant dependency. The potter could no longer hunt, the basket weaver could no longer gather. They were all cogs in a machine designed to feed the stationary population, and the machine was controlled by the few who mastered the art of extraction. The psychological shift was equally devastating. The Paleolithic world was alive. Every tree, every stream, every animal held spiritual significance, a constantly shifting, fluid cosmology reflecting their constant, necessary movement. The Neolithic world demanded predictability, ritual, and rigid subservience to the agricultural cycle. Their gods became terrifyingly fixed, demanding deities of rain, of soil fertility, of the brutal cycle of death and rebirth required for the harvest. The fear of crop failure was far more immediate and lethal than the fear of a wild beast, demanding increasingly complex, anxiety-driven rituals and desperate sacrifices to appease the soil gods who held the fate of the entire village in their hands. This religious intensification required full-time specialists. The early priests and shamans who monopolized the sacred knowledge and mediated the terrifying relationship between the farmer and the land. They cemented the power structure, using divine sanction and terrifying omens to enforce the labor schedule and the highly unequal distribution of the sacred surplus, justifying the elite's right to control life and death. This was the final, irreversible step, the total confinement of the human spirit. They could no longer walk away from their problems. They had to appease them, manage them, and sacrifice to them. The gilded cage had now acquired a spiritual lock, ensuring that the descendants of the free walkers would never look back, trapped forever in the rhythm of the plow and the anxious gaze toward the uncertain sky. The seeds of empires were sown, not in battlefields, but in the anxious silence of the crowded village, where hierarchy, disease, and unending work became the terrifying new normal, awaiting only the invention of writing to record its inevitable, glorious, and devastating fall into the abyss of true civilization. The abyss was not empty. It was filling fast, not with the easy freedom of the hunt, but with mud, plaster, and the choking smoke of permanent hearths. The trap had sprung, and now the captured were forced to build their own cages, bigger and stronger than anything that came before. The terrifying realization began to dawn across the Fertile Crescent. This was forever. No more migration. No chance to simply walk away from the mess they had created, the massive piles of waste, the fields demanding unending attention, and the desperate, hungry faces of their neighbors. What happens when you can't run? you fortify. And the first great monuments of this panicked new era were not temples to the gods of the wind, but towering defenses against each other. War, once a rare skirmish of honor or territory, became an existential necessity driven by the scarcity they themselves had engineered. Jericho, a name that echoes through history, was not just a village. It was a desperate statement etched in stone and mud brick. Around 9000 BCE, while the rest of humanity was still enjoying the Paleolithic vacation, the residents of Jericho were already sweating under the burden of massive stone walls. These were fortifications 6 feet thick, topped by an ominous 30-foot watchtower built from rough-hewn stone. Why? Who were they so desperately afraid of that required such monumental labor? The answer chills the blood. Their neighbors, other desperate farmers just like them, starving for the very same patches of fertile ground and the meager stores of grain they had stockpiled. Fear was the chief architect of the Neolithic age. Every brick laid, every field fenced, was a declaration of permanent territorial violence, a horrifying contract signed in fear and mud. Then there was Çatalhöyük, the monster city of Anatolia, a sprawling, terrifying hive that housed perhaps 10,000 souls, packed together like insects in a nest, the largest settlement the world had ever known at that time. Imagine the sheer, overwhelming density of life, where there were no streets, only roofs. They built their world inward, a claustrophobic labyrinth of interconnected rectangular homes, entered not through doors on the ground, but down ladders through holes in the ceiling, a defensive strategy born of unrelenting paranoia and the constant threat of attack. Every evening, the ladders came up, sealing the village like a massive, collective tomb, ensuring that the pervasive fear of the outside world was matched only by the suffocating proximity of the inside. It was a civilization built entirely on suspicion, where the roof was the highway and the earth was the grave. This density, this permanent confinement, necessitated a horror far worse than simple tribal conflict, bureaucracy and specialized labor. When everyone hunted, everyone was equal. When everyone farmed, they were still somewhat equal in effort. But when you needed someone to manage the grain store, someone to bake the pots to hold the grain, and someone else to stand permanent guard on the tower, the cracks of hierarchy appeared. The first non-food producers were born, the proto-priests, the full-time guards, the architects and masons dedicated solely to the construction of massive walls. Their hands were cleaner, their bellies fuller, and their power grew with every surplus bushel they controlled, not produced. This was the genesis of the elite, the ruling class forged not in bravery or prowess, but in the dreary necessity of agricultural logistics and resource hoarding. The Paleolithic mind valued portability. Their treasures were few and carried easily. The Neolithic mind began to fetishize stuff. They accumulated, stored, and obsessed over material wealth, pots, tools, idols, and especially the hard-won grain. This obsession with accumulation was not happiness. It was a deeply ingrained anxiety, the fear that the winter stores might fail, that the flood might come, or that the desperate man from the next valley might breach the wall. They traded the terrifying, immediate danger of the saber-toothed cat for the slow, grinding, existential terror of famine and social collapse. A truly terrible exchange, trading the excitement of freedom for the tyranny of possessions. The old gods of the open air and the moving herd were fading into irrelevance. The new deities were local, territorial, and deeply concerned with fertility and, most importantly, the contents of the silo. The most vital structure in the village was now the granary, the literal difference between life and mass death, turning spirituality into an insurance policy for the harvest. And within these cramped, fixed villages, the ultimate betrayal of health took hold, a biological catastrophe waiting to explode. For 2 million years, human waste was left behind. The group moved on, and the pathogens were diluted by the vastness of the planet, rendering them largely harmless. Now, they were drinking from the same water source they were defecating near. They slept feet away from their stored grain, which attracted hordes of rodents, the ultimate vector for global plague, thriving on the very abundance man had created. Measles, smallpox, influenza, tuberculosis, these were not ancient enemies. They were the terrifying, customized biological weapons that the farming revolution unleashed upon itself by bringing animals and people into constant, unhygienic contact. Civilization was a petri dish, and we were the doomed, multiplying culture within it, setting the stage for the plagues that would define the next 10,000 years of human misery. The walls of Jericho weren't just keeping people out, they were trapping the sickness within, amplifying it until it became unstoppable. The unstoppable sickness, trapped within the mud-brick labyrinth of Jericho, was not the only horror that the settled life unleashed. As the population swelled, choked by their own refuse and their proximity to domesticated animals, a biological nightmare waiting to happen. A new, insidious infection began to spread, the infection of hierarchy. For millennia, the hunter-gatherer bands operated on fluid, temporary leadership, guided by skill and consensus. But now, with vast stores of grain that needed defending, managing, and distributing, the temporary leader hardened into the permanent boss, the gatekeeper of survival itself. Who decided whose meager portion was increased, or whose was denied when the inevitable famine swept through? The answer was simple and catastrophic: the person who controlled the surplus. And controlling the surplus required specialization, the ultimate betrayal of the universal human skill set. The Paleolithic man was a master of everything required to survive: a tracker, a toolmaker, a strategist, a physician, a storyteller. He was complete. The Neolithic man, weighed down by the perpetual task of tending the fields, was forced into a single, restrictive role. He was no longer a complete human being. He was just a cog in the ever-grinding, soul-crushing machine of agriculture. One man was told only to make pots, his hands permanently stained with clay, dreaming of the open plain he would never see again. Another was tasked solely with weaving cloth, his eyes strained by the dim light of the crowded interior, producing fabrics that would clearly delineate who was rich and who was poor. This division was a spiritual amputation, a radical breaking of the ancient human covenant of self-reliance. And as skills diverged, so did power. The farmers, the producers of the actual food, ironically found themselves immediately at the bottom of the pyramid, the producers of wealth who owned none of it. The rising elite, the managers, the priests, the men who claimed they could read the stars and interpret the fickle moods of the newly invented, often vengeful gods, did not toil in the muck. Their role was to justify the suffering and enforce the rules of the new, highly unfair economic game. They organized the massive labor necessary to build the first true monuments, not just simple shelters, but towering silos and defensive fortifications far grander than anything needed by a small cooperative community. These structures were not simply expressions of piety or communal spirit. They were concrete symbols of centralized authority, demanding forced labor and absolute, unquestioning compliance. Imagine the sheer terror. You are pulled from your grueling fieldwork, given a heavy shovel and a brutal quota, and told you must move tons of earth for a building whose spiritual purpose you barely understand, and whose material purpose is simply to safeguard the wealth of the few, all while your own small patch of crops withers in the sun. This was the raw, terrifying birth of monumental, state-level oppression. It was the very first construction project built not with collaborative joy, but with resentment and the threat of starvation. And what happens, what horrific chemical reaction occurs when one agricultural settlement, fat with stored grain, encounters another? The Neolithic dispute involved the destruction of fixed, irreplaceable, absolutely essential capital. If your harvest was burned, if your vital water supply was diverted, if your stored seed grain was stolen just before planting season, your entire community faced absolute, non-negotiable extinction. The fight was no longer about pride or temporary shifting resources. It was about the scorched earth survival of the lineage itself. This terrifying calculus spurred the Neolithic arms race, turning neighbors into sworn, eternal enemies. They began to perfect and hone weapons not just for the honorable task of hunting, but explicitly and brutally for killing other humans in mass engagements. The humble woodworking axe became the specialized battle axe, polished and balanced for maximum skull penetration and efficient, repetitive slaughter. Slingshots evolved far beyond their simple use, becoming precise, deadly instruments of fired clay and heavy stone, designed to rain down lethal projectiles from the relative safety of the newly massive walls. Suddenly, warfare was formalized, demanding a profound level of organization and logistics never before seen. It required strategy, mobilization, and dedicated, full-time defenders, the first true soldiers in human history, men trained only in the swift, brutal art of extinguishing human life on command. They were the terrifying guardians of the stored surplus, ready to kill their neighbors not out of immediate necessity, but for the abstract, newly sacred concept of property. This was the ultimate, shattering blow to the cooperative, communal spirit of the Paleolithic era, a psychic wound that has never healed. The great, dark paradox of civilization was revealed in the mud brick villages. The very structures built to protect life and ensure security required the systematic, ingenious invention of better, faster ways to end it. The grain that promised long-term security became the inevitable magnet for unprecedented large-scale violence, hardening the human heart and forging the first unbreakable chains of perpetual, organized conflict. The Neolithic age had not brought peace. It had merely formalized the savagery, giving it a permanent address, a towering wall, and a uniform of fear. The formalized savagery demanded a price paid not in grain, but in freedom. When the walls went up, the shield-bearers were born, a specialized caste whose sole terrifying purpose was violence. They were fed by the surplus, meaning their existence was directly subsidized by the sweat of the farmer, creating the first great unbridgeable canyon of class. This was the catastrophic irony. To protect the harvest, the farmer had to surrender his agency to the man with the bronze axe, the professional killer. The Paleolithic world had known skirmishes. The Neolithic invented the career soldier. And a career soldier must be paid, which required a system, a ledger, and ultimately a ruler. This new, rigid social contract metastasized into absolute specialization. No longer was a man a hunter, toolmaker, doctor, and storyteller all at once. Now he was merely the weaver, the potter, the miller, or the slave who turned the grinding stone, repeating the same soul-crushing motion until his body gave out. His skill set, once vast as the savanna horizon, was now restricted to the width of a single clay tablet. This was the true, silent terror of civilization. The individual identity was crushed into the service of the machine, a component that could be replaced, never truly missed. But the greatest source of power, the ultimate choke point for control, was not the wall, but the water. As settlements swelled into massive urban centers in the dusty plains of Mesopotamia, farming became impossible without intricate, monumental irrigation systems. Think of the Euphrates and the Tigris, vast, unpredictable, life-giving monsters. Channeling them, protecting the canals from silt and sabotage, and distributing that precious moisture across thousands of acres demanded a chilling degree of centralized authority, a terrifying new form of absolute control. This was the birth of hydraulic despotism. The man who controlled the sluice gate controlled life itself. He could choose which field flourished and which family starved. A power more immediate and binding than any mythical deity had ever wielded. The people were bound, body and soul, to the rhythm's rhythm and to the will of the few who mastered its flow. The settlements of the Ubaid period, the precursors to the greatest Sumerian cities, grappled with the terrifying complexity of managing these watery beasts. Silt was the enemy, a constant, creeping tide that threatened to choke the very arteries of the community, demanding constant, coordinated labor on a scale never before imagined. This organizational nightmare required thousands of bodies working in unison, directed by an unseen hand, establishing the first true state-sponsored labor camps. If you refused to dig the ditch, you lost the water, and losing the water meant death. There was no escape, no nomadic retreat back to the wilds. The population was too large, the wild too unforgiving after centuries of relying on the domesticated grain. The sheer logistical nightmare of coordinating this water network, the timing of the floodgates, the required annual maintenance, the collection of grain taxes to pay the laborers, could no longer be entrusted to simple memory or oral tradition. The system demanded documentation, and so the world got writing. Not as a poetic medium for grand ideas, but as the cold, brutal instrument of accounting. The first sentences etched onto clay tablets were not declarations of love or epic poems, but terrifyingly complex receipts for barley, tallies of livestock, and chilling lists of debt that tied generations to the soil. The scribes, those meticulous, silent priests of calculation, became the invisible overlords. Their power derived from their ability to translate the chaotic reality of the harvest into neat, quantifiable columns of oppression. They were the architects of the bureaucracy, the gatekeepers of state memory. And what they documented was property. Land, which had once been the shared, endless domain of the wandering tribe, was now meticulously measured, mapped, and assigned ownership. A radical, violent concept that necessitated constant legal and physical defense. The boundaries were drawn, and for the first time in human history, there were absolute insiders and terrified outsiders. To be outside the walls meant you were a threat to the stored grain, a barbarian, a target for organized raids. The very act of settlement created the necessity for its own defense, fueling the perpetual war machine and solidifying the power of the warrior caste. The Neolithic farmer, tethered to his few acres, now lived under the unblinking, bureaucratic eye of the emerging city-state, catalogued and taxed from birth until death. He had traded 2 million years of ancestral freedom for the illusion of security, only to find himself trapped in a new, infinitely more subtle cage. His life was predictable, yes, but predictable in the way a factory schedule is predictable, a relentless cycle of servitude dependent entirely on the goodwill of the distant, powerful man who held the ledger and commanded the water. The individual was no longer a sovereign entity. They were a unit of production, a line item on a tablet, disposable and replaceable. The age of the individual died silently in the shadow of the ziggurat, replaced by the crushing, magnificent terror of the collective state, a structure built on walls of mud brick and held together by the cold, unforgiving mathematics of centralized control.